Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is another lecture for History 101. And this is part two. I usually write part two down there, but I didn't this time. Intellectual revival in late medieval Europe. And I was talking about Abelard and the questions that he raised, considering whether the church fathers always knew what they were talking about. But there was another big issue that started to become important, actually, towards the end of the time that Abelard was alive, in the 1100s. And this had to do with the rediscovery of the ancient Greek philosophers. And you may ask, well, why did there need to be a rediscovery of the ancient Greek philosophers? They'd always been there all along, hadn't they? Well, not in the West. Because when there had been this split that I've been telling you about between the Eastern Christian Church and the Western Christian Church, the Eastern Church had continued to use the Greek language. In fact, Greece was on the east side of that division between East and West, so it's understandable. The Western part of Europe had used Latin, had continued to use Latin as the kind of language that everybody had in common. They didn't necessarily run around speaking Latin, but if you had any kind of pretensions to being an intellectual, you learned Latin because most of the important intellectual writings were being written in Latin. However, everybody had forgotten how to speak Greek. And, when you forget how to speak Greek, then you're going through your library cleaning things out, and you find a Greek manuscript of Aristotle, and you're like, I can't even read Greek anymore. I'm just going to throw this away. So by the 1100s, there was very little direct knowledge of what the Greek philosophers, for instance, had been doing. There were Roman writers like St. Augustine who talked a lot about what the Greek... By the way, Augustine hated reading Greek. He was a big Latin guy, but he hated Greek. So he himself had probably never read Aristotle in the original language, and probably wouldn't have wanted to, because there were Latin writers who summarized Aristotle's thought, and that was good enough for Augustine. But it's if you're going to do a really close study of a philosopher, it's best to have the philosopher in the original language. And the Western Europe just had lost track of the original ideas and writings of Aristotle. There's an interesting group of people who rise to the rescue, and that is the Muslims. As I say in this chart, the knowledge of Greek had died out in the Western Empire, but as I pointed out, they still have Greek, they still read and write Greek in Constantinople, and they still have in the Constantinopolitan libraries copies of the ancient Greek philosophers in the original Greek. Now, but of course, those copies had not been getting to the West because the Eastern Church and the Western Church were not getting along. However, the Arab philosophers who arose with the rise of Islam came up from Saudi Arabia to Constantinople. They asked to borrow the copies of Aristotle that people had in Constantinople and translated them from Greek to Arabic. And because these guys were not just translators, but scholars, they made commentaries on the philosophers, such as Aristotle, which are still very important today. Many great Arabic philosophers are read in and studied by people who are primarily interested in Aristotle, because the Arabic philosophers had lots of interesting ideas about him. Now, the reason this is an important step is that if you are a Muslim, you are required to know how to read and write Arabic, because the Quran, the sacred book, not the one sacred book, but a sacred book that the Muslims think is really important for everybody to read, is written in Arabic, and they think you should be able to read the Quran in the original Arabic language. So everybody who's a good Muslim learns how to read and write Arabic, which means that as Islam expands from Saudi Arabia all the way across North Africa and up into southern Spain, all of those people read Arabic, whether or not it's the original birth language that they speak. Therefore, all of those people can read the Arabic translations of Aristotle and the commentaries upon them. And this is important because it reintroduces Aristotle into Europe, technically, into from North Africa and into southern Spain, which is at that time controlled by the Muslims, and especially and importantly into the city of Cordoba. If you go to Cordoba today, you will find lots of beautiful Islamic architecture, mosques and minarets and things like that, which are left over from the Muslim control of southern Spain. Cordoba and southern Spain at that time, by the way, was an interesting contradiction of a lot of the things we usually think are typical about the story between Christians and Jews and Muslims. During the period that I'm talking about, there were all three living in southern Spain. Muslims, contrary to stereotypical belief, Muslims have no problem with Jews and Christians. They accept the Bible as a sacred text, and they are perfectly willing to let Christians and Jews live in areas that the Muslims control. Sometimes people have to pay a tax, and they're not allowed to do things like sell pork openly in the markets because the Muslims think that pork is not a food that you should eat. But they were all able to get along, and this period of multicultural cooperation in this period is sometimes referred to as scholars as the period of convivencia, which literally means living together, being able to get along. So the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims have not always been furious enemies. There have been periods in Spanish history, at least, where they were all able to get along. Why the differences began to accumulate, I will maybe explain in a subsequent lecture, but for the time being, they were able to get along. And one of the most important figures, I don't mention it there, but I mention it here. One of the most important figures who's part of this period is a guy whose birth name was Moses ben Maimon. He was a Jew. He was famous throughout Europe. And there was an expression that people said, from Moses unto Moses, there was none like unto Moses, which meant there was the first Moses in the Bible who led the Israelites out of Egypt. There was the second Moses, Moses ben Maimon, and there wasn't any Moses in between who was nearly as important as those two Moseses. Very often what European scholars did when they ran across a name that they were having trouble pronouncing or something like that, they would translate it into another name. And the Greek word for Moses ben Maimon was Maimonides, and that's the name that he's usually referred to by. Moses ben Maimon was one of the people who was responsible for completing this arc from the original Greek languages of Aristotle in Constantinople through the Arabic translations of Arabic translations of Aristotle that were transmitted across North Africa and up into southern Spain. And then Moses ben Maimon would translate the Arabic into Hebrew, which was a language that Europeans did not speak. Because, for instance, the people who were studying the Bible learned how to speak it, so it was okay for. And of course, Jews who could also speak Latin would be able to translate the Hebrew into Latin. So, the pretty much original writings of Aristotle, translated several times, and to which this very valuable Muslim commentary had been added, began to become available in Europe and able to be read by European scholars. And a peculiar question arises, which is that Aristotle was not Christian. He lived, in fact, before the birth of Christ. This was not so much a question for Jews, who regarded Jesus as a great teacher, but not as the game changer that Christian people thought he was. But for Christian writers, and most scholars in Western Europe were Christians, a lot of people are saying, it's all very interesting that we were able to find Aristotle pretty close to the original, but I still don't think it's okay for us to study Aristotle because he was not a Christian. And why should you be spending so much time studying a non-Christian writer? Much better that you should be studying the works of St. Augustine, for instance, who was definitely a Christian. But then there were all sorts of people who were saying, well, I don't want to say they're wrong, but I would really like to study Aristotle. And it would be great to be able to come up with an argument for people as to why this is not a bad thing. Moses ben Maimon to the rescue. He writes a book in 1190 called The Guide for the Perplexed, in which he basically tries to answer this question. He's talking about the difficulties that Jews have in studying Aristotle, because, of course, Aristotle was not a Jew either. But the argument that he makes is an interesting one, and I have reproduced part of it in your source book. This is on pages 12 and 13. And here's the argument that he gives. I do not believe, and this is in a box on page 12, I do not believe that it is through the interference of divine providence that a certain leaf drops from a tree, nor do I hold that when a certain spider catches a fly, that this is the direct result of a special decree and will of God in that moment. It is not by a particular divine decree that the spittle of a certain person moved, fell on a certain gnat in a certain place and killed it, nor is it by the direct will of God that a certain fish catches and swallows a certain worm on the surface of the water. In all these cases, the action is, according to my opinion, entirely due to chance, as taught by Aristotle. Divine providence is connected with divine intellectual influence, and the same beings which are benefited by the latter, so as to become intellectual, and to comprehend things comprehensible to rational beings, are also under the control of divine providence, which examines all their deeds in order to reward or punish them. It may be by mere chance that a ship goes down with all her contents, he's talking about that earlier, or the roof of a house falls upon those within, but it is not due to chance, according to our view, that in the one instance the men went into the ship or remained in the house in the other instance. It is due to the will of God and is in accordance with the justice of his judgments, the method of which our mind is incapable of understanding. So, what Maimonides is doing here is, it's a sort of a halfway argument. He says there are some things that Aristotle can't tell us about. There are some things that we have to go to the Bible and we have to go to theology in order to understand why people do the things they do, why they commit sins, things like that. But, he says, there's a lot of stuff that we would describe as natural science that takes place, we would study it in biology or chemistry or physics or something like that. And we don't have to know about what God thinks in order to study these things, because God's got more important stuff on his mind than to concern himself with controlling the movements of a bug or the leaf on a tree. God's not, he is able to let that kind of stuff go and operate according to natural laws, and therefore we can study that stuff if we're interested in it without being a bad Christian, because even though it doesn't really have anything to do with Christianity, that's okay, because figuring out how a leaf falls from a tree does not help us to understand how to become better Christians. So he's basically giving people the permission, or basically arguing that it's okay for people to study Aristotle as long as it doesn't get into these things that Maimonides says that really only God has the answer to. So the person who's most important in this situation is a man named Thomas Aquinas, and I'm going to stop the tape one more time and start the third part of this lecture